The boy was strong and kind, and now he was inside of this clean cottage. He liked things to be clean, but he really didn't like to have to clean anything himself. It was his grandfather's cottage, and he was alone inside of this place, and he was sweeping and cleaning and grumbling to himself because he really didn't like to have to clean. But on this late autumn evening, as he was cleaning the old cottage, he was sweeping with a broom, he was pushing with a hand brush, and the hand brush went against something hard. At first he thought it would be a whole bucket full of treasure. It was round, and it was coloured on the outside. He licked at his lips. He rubbed his hands in anticipation as he reached towards this thing, and it wasn't a bucket full of treasure. It was, in fact, a paint pot. An old paint pot that was dirty and it stained his fingers. He looked at it and thought, what is this? His hands were covered with paint, and he didn't like it. When his grandfather returned, he looked at his grandson's hands. Why, what's happened to you? You don't really like to have your hands dirty. And it was then that the boy took from behind his back the paint pot. What's this, Grandad? Where did you get this? The old man smiled. Well, you don't know much about me, do you? You haven't really visited us that much. Well, when I was younger, about your age, I used to be a painter. I used to paint pictures. I got quite good at it. I got quite famous. People like my pictures a lot. Would you like to see one of my pictures? The grandson said, yes, of course I would. I really would. I really, really, really would. Have you got any more? Have you got some upstairs? Have you got any? The grandfather looked and said, no, I don't have any, but you can still see them. The boy scratched at his chin and thought, does that mean that you're going to have to go to somebody else's house to go and get another one of those paintings? The old man smiled and said, oh, no, everybody can get to see my pictures. They're in an art gallery. The boy looked, an art gallery? Where's there an art gallery close to here? The old man said, tomorrow morning, as soon as the sun comes up, we're going to go into town and I'm going to show you some of my paintings. Sure enough, they came to an old building. It had huge columns at its front and great wide doors, and when they went inside, the boy's heart was beating faster than a drum. He couldn't believe it. He was going to see one of his granddad's paintings. He looked all around, and there he could see a beautiful picture. A picture with the sun shining. It was shining down on soft shell sand. There was a woman, a beautiful woman, playing by the side of the water and smiling. And in the corner of the picture, you could see his own surname. But it was with his granddad's initials in front of it. Grandad, did you paint that picture here in this gallery? The grandfather said, oh, yes, I did. Would you show me how to paint like that? But you don't like getting your hands dirty, said the old man. I don't care. If I could paint pictures as good as that, I don't care if I got my face, hands, knees and legs dirty. The two of them would go down by the side of the sea and sit in deck chairs with an easel in front of them and paint pictures of the sand and the horizon and the boat that would sail past. And the boy became a man, and his hands were always dirty, dirty with paint. But he always had a smile on his face as he painted pictures by the sun going down on the horizon at the seaside. Tom loved museums better than anything else in all of this world. He would always look at the ancient Egyptians. He would look at the old machinery that had come from the century before this, and even before that.
He loved to look at things that were old. But now he was in town, going shopping with his mum, and as he looked up, all he could see was how tall she was above him, and how she was dragging him along the streets. They were getting close to the museum. It was an ancient museum with huge doorways and a beautiful smell inside of polished wood. He loved to look inside of the glass cases, all of the things that had come from the time before this time. But now, on this icy winter's morning, rain was starting to fall. They were very close to the museum. Tom was starting to pull at his mum's hand. Could we just for a minute, we'd be out of the rain and everything. His mum did want to do the shopping. His mum did want to get everything finished. His mum didn't want to waste any time going into a museum. But she didn't like to get wet. Go on, Mum, go on, please, can we go into the museum just for a little while, please? And to get out of that icy winter's rain, the mother reluctantly went inside. She had to duck down as she went in through the doors. Tom felt very excited. He loved to look at everything. All of the pictures on the wall, all of the little descriptions by the side of the object. Just to stand beside the glass cases was enough for him. But he could see that his mum had gone a little bit further into the museum, and he wasn't sure whether it was the rain that had fallen on her brow and was dripping from over her eyes, but it looked almost as if she had a tear in her eye. She was looking into a glass case, and inside of the glass case there was an old, worn teddy bear. Ma'am? He slipped his hand inside of hers. Ma'am, what is it? Are you all right? He could tell that she was nearly close to crying, but she gulped and said, Yes, I'm fine. It's just when I look at that teddy bear, it reminds me of a teddy bear that your great-grandmother gave to me, and I lost it. I was ever so upset when I was little, and for a moment Tom realised that it was his job to cheer his mum up. Oh, come on, Mum, you come with me. He started to drag her, and usually she would resist. Usually she would not let him pull her towards anything other than getting back into the car and going back home. But this time, perhaps it was because she was a little bit upset, but she allowed him to pull her along, and they went into a gallery, and inside of the gallery it was filled with toys, old toys. He and his mum played with everything, because it had a big sign at the side that said, Please touch. And they played with spinning tops. He pushed it down at the top, and there was a beautiful smell of metal in the air, metal and rust, and his mum started to talk to Tom in a way that they'd never talked before. She told him all about the toys that she used to play with when she was little. Not the kind of toys that they would get now, buzzers and bells and wires and screens, buttons to press and noises that they made. She talked about how, with her mother and her grandmother, Tom's great-grandmother, they would play outside in the yard. They would scratch on the ground. They would play hopscotch. And when it came for them to go outside and go back home, they had to go through the shop. Inside of the shop there were all sorts of toys, new toys, toys from other museums that needed batteries and bells and buzzers and wires. But Tom's mum stopped by the part of the shop that had old toys, and she bought a skipping rope. Tom couldn't believe it, but when they got home, they went out into the garden, and she started to skip. And as she skipped, she looked like the girl that he knew she was inside. She looked so much younger. She looked so much happier. He said to her, Mum, will you teach me how to skip? Will you, please? And for all of his toys that needed to be plugged in, that had TV screens, the best fun he had was when he and his mother used the old skipping rope that they'd got from the museum. Ever since he'd been a boy, he had always fished by the side of this river. It was a long river. It had always had fast-flowing water inside of it. But now, on this rainy spring morning, he was wishing that he could fish. But the water was green. The factories further upstream had started to clog the water, and there weren't so many fish in the water anymore. Ever since Victoria had come to the throne, everyone had thought about money, about making factories, how they could make better iron, how they could make more things. And it seemed to be that the water was reflecting just how greedy some people were getting. For out of the factories spilled dirty water, water that was clogging it with green weeds. But this fisherman, he was playing with his brother. He was playing with his brother a game by the side of the river, and it was as they were playing, the two of them, grown men, now playing as if they were boys again. They could see the factory owner's daughter there. She was looking. She had fine linen dresses on her back. She looked at the two men and said, "What do you think you are doing? You shouldn't be here. My father owns this river, and I don't know why you're playing like children. You should be in our factory, then you would make some money." The two of them said nothing. It's a terrible thing to say, but the two of them were tall and strong. You couldn't really tell that they weren't twins, but they were very similar. And people would call them names. They would call them names and say that they had no sense inside of their heads, for all they had to do was fish. Well, they might not have had any qualifications, they might not have been to school, but they were not fools. And they knew that it was better not to say anything at all. And still the girl wagged a finger at them. "You two, you haven't been to school. You two aren't as clever as I am. You two..." And the two of them continued on, playing the game. They were using some old wooden butter pats, and they were bashing a ball from side to side, one to the other, but the girl was now angry. She walked straight up to them. "What do you think you're doing, ignoring me?" And still they said nothing. They could see that it was her father and his factory that was filling the river with all of the green slime, and the fish could not live. They might not have had schooling, but they knew enough to know that her father was causing all of this trouble. She stamped her feet by the side of this long river, and she stamped her beautiful shoes in the thick, slimy mud, and she slipped and she fell, and she cascaded and fell into the water. Her beautiful white linen dress was now filled with slime, but she could not swim. She screamed and yelled, and I've got to tell you, even though she'd been so rude and mean to them, he didn't wait. He didn't wait for a second. He jumped into the water, and he was tall and he was strong, and she was slipping further and further and lower in the water. But he was tall enough to put his feet at the bottom of the water, reach up and push her out. But all of that green slime was filling inside of his mouth and his nose, and he slowly floated to the top of the water, pleased that she was safe. This girl, who had been so mean, and his brother, pulled him out of the water. But when he awoke, there was a smell in the air, a smell that he did not know, the smell of soap. It caught at his tongue and his nose and his throat. But there was a father. He'd been washed and cleaned and was laying in a bed that was covered with white linen sheets. "What's that smell?" the man said. "Oh, my dear sir," said her father. "My dear sir, that is the smell of soap. Don't tell me you've never used soap." He didn't really want to say that he'd only had a wash in the water of the stream. And "What can I do for you?" her father said. "You saved my daughter's life, and I promise you that I will do anything that I can." People might have called him a fool. People might have said that he had no schooling, but he didn't wait for a single breath. "I would like you, and I know it's you, I would like you to stop putting all of that filthy water into the river. It's filling it up with slime and weeds, and the fish can't swim." The factory owner knew that he had to keep his promise. And I'm not going to tell you that he stopped all of the production inside of the factory, but it certainly slowed. And with time, fish that had once only been as big as your little finger were now as big as your hand. The water did not move as it had done, but it certainly moved faster. The green and the slime and the weeds were starting to go. But there was one thing. As he would stand by the side of the river and throw out his line and catch fish, he swore to himself that he would never wash with soap for as long as he lived. Even though Victoria was the queen, it was still a man's world. But she was a woman who was rich. She was happy to do what was not expected women to do. She was tall and strong, and inside of her heart she had a great deal of adventure. And now she found herself on an ocean-going yacht, far away from England and far away from men whose tongues would wag and say that she was a woman who did not know her place. She was far away on an ocean that was as flat and as calm as a mirror. Now the yacht, as the sun shone in this early hour, as the sun shone upon it, it looked golden and glistening. This rich woman was not alone on her yacht, for she had brought with her a servant. Not a manservant, but a woman who was nearly as tall as she. Now, just as she was incredibly rich, her servant was very poor. But it didn't stop her from being any kind of a fool, for she would look over the edge of the boat, and she would look. She would see the oceans, she would see the lands, she would see the strange creatures, and she would admire the way that her mistress had taken her away from the heart of London to come and look at some of the furthest parts of Victoria's empire. This was not a holiday, for this rich woman wanted to bring things back that people had never seen, whether they were rich or they were poor, whether they were a commoner or a queen, so that they could be placed inside of a museum for everyone to see. And it wasn't the first time that she travelled far over the unfriendly waters, but she'd brought back many things to the museums, things that men would grudgingly look at and say, "Yes, I suppose you did a good job bringing back those things from the other continents." But now, as she stood by the side of the water, she stood and looked at the ocean, she took a brush from out of her bag and started to comb her long and lustrous hair. But when she looked into the water, she could see something that was floating there. It looked small and thin and seemed to move this way and that. Now, she was frightened, but not so frightened that you could tell by the look on her face, for she had a great curiosity inside of her heart, as well as a spirit of adventure. She looked towards it. She hoped that it might lead to treasure, great treasures of the other civilizations, so that everyone in London could see what she'd brought back. But then she looked at it. Whatever it was that floated in the water, it was alive. It had skin that was sleek and scaled. She thought that it must be some kind of a monster, and she was frightened. Now her hand faltered on the rail at the side of the boat. She slipped and she fell in the water with a great and a terrible splash. But her maidservant heard her falling into the water, and from her work where she was scrubbing at the deck, she didn't hesitate for a single heartbeat, for she threw herself into the water to save her mistress. But there was one thing that she'd forgotten to do. There were two women, alone, at the far reaches of Victoria's empire, and she had forgotten to lower the ladder so that they could get back onto the yacht. The two of them knew that there was no way that they could climb up the smooth and golden surface of the yacht. So they swam, the two of them, side by side. They swam until they came to dry land. I'll tell you this, the woman, still with the curiosity inside of her heart, and still with the great spirit of adventure, when they had landed on that far and distant shore, she started to look about. She found things, treasure, not buried, but laying by the side of some old temple. She picked them up. She put them into a pile and waited for the day that perhaps someone would return. Now the two of them, they could not say that one was rich and the other was poor, for the two of them had to survive. The mistress had always been friendly, but as the two of them, as equal as any man or woman on all of this earth, the two of them were equal, even though they were surrounded by gold and silver that they could not spend. The two of them became great friends. And I've got to tell you that the rich woman was astonished at how much her maidservant had learned. And the two of them would sit there, and they would brush at their hair, and sit and watch the sun go down by the side of the flat, smooth ocean. And she knew that when they returned to the heart of Victoria's empire, she would have many things to tell them. No, not her alone. The two of them, as equals, had much to tell the world that they would be able to see when it was placed inside of a museum. As the sun rose on the last day of summer, this poor boy got from out of his bed, a bed that he had to share with his 6 brothers and sisters. It was a large family, but his father had died. He had come to this place, to this city, this dirty city, to work in the mines. And there was a house that was attached to the job that he took. But when he died, the whole of the family were turfed out and onto the streets. But he'd found a job in the baker's, and he knew that once he got there and opened up the door, he could take the corner off a loaf of bread, and he'd be able to put it inside of his mouth, and the sweet taste upon his tongue, lips and teeth would take that gnawing hunger from out of his belly. And now he walked through the streets, a crowded place. The houses were not tall, but there were many of them, for this was a populous city. Now that Victoria was on the throne, everybody wanted to make money and have it in their hands and their pockets, but he was working to keep the whole of his large family alive. His mother tried as best as she could, but his brothers and sisters were all younger than him, so he was the only one who earned money to keep them all alive. He had to walk past the side of the river, and on the river there were boats, and he could see children even younger than him who were working on the boats to pull in the fish, to put down all of the goods on the quayside. And just as he was about to open the door to the factory, the bread factory, he could hear crying. It was crying from a boy, a small boy, younger than him, but he could tell by his clothes that this boy was not poor, for he had shoes on his feet and no dirt on his face. The poor boy went over to him. "Where are you? Well, what are you doing here? You seem to be a long way from your home. What's your work?" The rich boy wept and cried, and salty tears rolled down the side of his cheeks. "I'm lost, I'm far away from home. I don't know where I am, I'm lost in the city." And the boy, who knew that he would get in trouble with the overseer for not getting onto his shift and making and counting the biscuits and packing them for people richer than him to eat, he knew that he would be in trouble, but he had a good heart. And he said, "Well, where do you live? Tell me something about the place that you live." The boy still kept crying, "I live by the side of a church. It has a great white steeple at its side." And the boy hadn't travelled more than 7 miles out of the great city But he knew that he had seen that church, the white church, and he knew that part of the city. Well, I know where that is, and I'll take you there. All he could think about was the beating that he would get from the overseer. For anyone who was late would get some of the small amount of money that they got for their long hours of work taken from them. But he thought that he would help this poor young boy who was richer than him. When he came to the door, he knocked upon the huge door. It had a huge round brass knocker, and the door opened up, and there was a maidservant. "Go away, the master doesn't want to see you. Go away from this place." But the master and mistress of the house knew that their son was missing. "Who is it, Bessie? Who is it?" They ran to the door, and there they could see their son. They were so grateful to him, that they gave him a job. Not that he needed a job, but they gave him a job where he would work upon the trains. And a job working upon the trains was a job that would last for life. For the trains had only just been formed, the lines that had all been made, the train tracks that ran from the top of Britain to the bottom of Britain, to the side, to the east, to the west, and to the north. They'd only just been formed, and it was a good job. The boy earned 3 times as much as he would have made inside of the bakery. At first, he had to sweep up the coal. Then he would have to polish inside of the station. But then he was given a job on the footplate, where he would have to shovel the coal and throw it into the huge hungry fire as the steam engines chugged their way across the whole of this great nation. When he became a man, he would rest his arm at the side of the train. He would look at the countryside whizzing past his eyes. He would pull upon the lever, and now he travelled more than 7 miles outside of the city. He travelled to the top of Britain, to the bottom, to the side, to the east and to the west. And he would smile, especially on the last day of summer. He would smile to himself and remember that his one good deed for someone who was richer and younger than himself had given him a good life outside of the bakery, a good life for him, his family, and his mother. On this cold winter's morning, the boy was climbing a tree. The tree was bent, but it was the place that he would hide a soft, cuddly toy, and inside of that toy he would place money. For this boy was a thief who would steal anything that he could. With his long, thin fingers, he would reach towards anything that he could, and quicker than a wink or a blink of an eye, whatever money belonged to someone else now belonged to him. He was happy. And some would say that he was bad, but he was happy being a thief, for now he had enough money, whereas he had never had enough money before. He'd never been to school, he'd never had to work, and now at the edge of the small dirty village, inside of the tree, he looked around and he could see everyone else who was walking towards the factories that had grown up by the side of the countryside. And it was the smoke from the chimneys that had made the dust lie all around this village that had once been so clean. The factories were tall. The factories had many chimneys at their top. And I've got to tell you, the boy would look, and sometimes he would think to himself, I am not just going to reach with my fingers and take what it is that I can. I shall break a window. I shall break a door. I shall see what is inside of that great factory. He worked it out inside of his head that many men went inside of that place. Boys his age would have to work inside of that place. But he was free and just like a bird, for he could do and go what he wanted to do and play when he saw that others would have to work.
He could choose how he lived his life. But now, a plan was inside of his head. If men and boys and women were going inside of that place, then he would not go inside. He would break through a window and find out what there was, because if they were making things inside of that factory, then money must be made, and he would make sure that that money would be his. I've told you already, he had never been to school, but he had not so many toys, just the small cuddly toy that was heavy with all of his money that he had stolen. But he had a peg doll, made from a clothes peg. He had been given these things by his father, but his father had died and he was alone. His father had given him a book that he could not read, but it was filled with pictures, and he loved to hold that book. So in all of this world, all he had was a soft cuddly toy, a peg doll, and a book that he could not read. That night, when the moon hung in the sky and left a silvery glow upon the icy ground, he decided that he would take a brick. He would take it, wrap it inside of his coat, and use that to smash a window to get inside. Once he was inside, there was a stench of oil. There was the smell of smoke and fire. Industry was springing up all over this great place, this great land. And it was then that he saw a book that was lying by the edge of the whole of the factory. He picked it up and looked at it, but it wasn't filled with pictures. It was filled with bold, hard writing. If he could have read it, he would have seen that it was a warning not to go any deeper inside of the factory. The next morning, the book was found out of its place, lying flat and face down in amongst all of the oil and the grime as the factory engines cooled. A coat was found with small slivers of glass, but the boy was never found. Years later, when that tree grew taller and stronger and straighter, in its boughs and in its branches there was found a small, soft, cuddly toy. And in amongst all of the stuffing, there were coins, pennies, farthings, halfpences, threepenny pieces and sixpences, that all bore the face of Victoria. No one knew how it had come to that place, and no one knew that it once belonged to a boy who was happy being a thief, who would climb into his tree and watch the smoke rise from the factory and their chimneys. The old coal fire was roaring in this old range. Now, this lady, this grandmother, loved her house just the way that it was. She hadn't changed a thing. On the mantelpiece there were still brass deer. Above the fireplace the clothes were drying, and she sat in the chair closest to the fire by the side of the old back door, and the cat was sometimes sleeping and sometimes awake, but she was firmly fast asleep, with the glasses at the tip of her nose. And while she was asleep in her old house, a man, a strong man, her grandson, who had worked almost all the way through the night, and now it was midday, in the brick factory. He had been working hard, making the bricks, forming the clay and firing them. He loved the idea that everything that he made was going to be used to make a building. And he loved the idea that with every brick, another building would grow bigger, and it would all be because of him. Now, he was going to go back to see his grandma. He loved his grandma very much. She hadn't changed a thing in the house, and he remembered, as he was getting closer to the door, the way that he had played with his old toys. The toys that he played with had belonged to his grandma,
Sometimes she said that some of them had belonged to her great-grandma. Old toys, good toys, toys that wouldn't get broken so easily. When he was little, he had played with a boat. Now, he couldn't sail the boat inside of the house because it didn't have a bathroom. He couldn't sail it in the river or the stream, but he would put it in an old tin bath that his grandma would fill with water and put out in the backyard, and he would sail the boat this way and that. And this tall, strong man, as he was going back to his grandma's house, smiled to himself and remembered how he had played with his grandma's toys. She had said, his grandma, had always said that she was never going to change a thing, and she was going to stay in this house for as long as she could. All around her, the houses had changed. All around her, time had moved on. But it was just like stepping into the past when he walked in through the old brown door, and he smiled to himself, for there was his grandma fast asleep, a cap on her head, glasses on her nose, and a cat on her knee. Now, the cat woke up as soon as he came in, but she didn't. He thought that he would play not a trick on her, but give her a big surprise. He would make her some tea. Now, the kettle was resting by the side of the fire, and before he had a chance to make the tea, the kettle whistled a loud, shrill, high noise, and she woke up and she looked at him. "Oh, you are a good boy. You've always been a good grandson to me. Grandma, I love your house. Your house is old, but it still reminds me of the past. It reminds me of when I was little. And when I walk in through the door, I feel as if I'm 6 again. Some of the things that you've got, nobody knows what they're for. The toys that you've got, nobody knows how to play with them anymore." The old woman thought that this was really sad. She brushed at a cat, and she thought to herself, "Things have changed. Perhaps I could work somewhere where I could show the children how to use brushes, how toys were made out of tin, how people would play with things and they would all sit around and play together, how they could use boats." I've got to tell you that all of the things that were inside of his grandmother's house, when she was no longer with them, they were placed inside of a museum. And he would go and visit with his own children. And he would look at the things inside of the house, and he would remember the things that he'd done. He would remember the way that things were. And inside of that museum, it was, when he closed his eyes, it was just like being back in his grandma's house.